May peace and blessings be with you. I'm going to discuss today with you guys another video lecture of Jaggi Vasudevji. And one thing I quite dislike about Jaggi Vasudevji is the fact that he takes a lot of time to answer a question, and he keeps on going on with his jokes and charisma to such an extent that it sometimes people just forget what the original question was. So the video that we are going to talk about today is this one, where a student asked JV, for short I'll call him JV, Jaggi Vasudevji. So this student asked him about God. So let's first listen to the question, see the question, and notice how the question is presented, because I've got a few things to say about that.
So I've been watching your videos for quite some time, and you've made an interesting comment that when you think of God, most people think of him as an old man sitting up there with a big beard, passing
You talking about me? The old beard sitting up here. Tell me further.
And so my question was, I was curious to understand what in your definition would be God.
So as you can see, the question is quite, to my understanding, this is a great question, and we should all try to get an answer to this question, because this will give us guidance in terms of how we live our lives. So, and the other thing is, most of us have got this question inside us. And I'm really glad that this gentleman asked this question, even though he was, the way Jaggi Vasudevji responded to his question with a little bit of joke, I thought that was not really appropriate. But yeah, it's his prerogative, actually. Now, if you think about it, the question is a profound question. And the thing that I started with, whether this question was actually answered in this question answer session, if you watch till the end, you will realize what happened. So JV is correct in, or at least I agree with JV in few of these points, that regardless of culture, regardless of geography, people have always asked this question. People always tried to figure out, where are we from? How did we come here? Now, that is an interesting question, and at the same time, this is a very important question, because this is what keeps us, puts us, or gives human beings the status of a superior creation. Because according to the theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, we came from apes to and became human beings. Now, has anybody ever noticed an ape sitting in a tree and trying to figure out, how did the world come about? I'm sure you haven't, because it hasn't happened. And the same is true for all the other animals. Human race is the only race that asks this question, that ponder over this sort of questions. And because of that, um, what it looks like is throughout the culture and history, people have asked this question from different groups and different society in different groups and in different societies. Now, one explanation can be that the reason that people ask this question is one explanation of that question is that this is how human beings are made. So human beings are made, are created with this question built in them. And that's why it doesn't matter where you go, people come up with some sort of God idea. Now, to get the answer, obviously the logical next step is to figure out whose definition or whose idea of God makes most sense. And so we can look into different ideas. JVG mentioned a few examples here. He talked about Idi Amin of Uganda, who claimed that God is black. And in other people's mind, God is in other ways. But in each case, you will see that it doesn't make sense to everybody. The definition of God doesn't make sense to everybody. And say, if you say God is a male, immediately all the women of the world will say, what about us? Why is God not a woman? So with the understanding of God, immediately you will find a group contesting that idea. The same is true if you think as in God is black. The white people will say, what about us? And if you say God is white, then they will say, what about us? And so what you can see is these answers, these definitions are not really accepted by everybody. So when we look at the concept of God, according to the dictionaries, God is a supernatural being with maximum or absolute power, absolute knowledge. So God has power over everything. God can do anything that is logically possible. That's an interesting thing we need to remember, because otherwise sometimes people actually get confused because of that statement. God can do anything, and they can lose. They can get absolutely confused in their head in terms of what those possibilities include. So anyway, I'll not get into that because that will be another big discussion. So let me try to focus back on the topic at hand. So what I was saying is, these definitions, these ideas about God from different groups, we can test them, we can see whether they make sense. And so far, the ideas that we got from the idea of an old man sitting up there, it doesn't really make sense. People ask, why is he man? Then somebody else will ask, why old? And there will be so many questions like that. And the in the answer of JV, he did allude to the idea that human beings will think that God is human, and other animals will think that God is a bigger version of those animals, which I don't think is a correct way of thinking about our reality, because as to start with, I explained that we don't see any evidence of any other being, any other animal in the world, in this earth, thinking about these questions, thinking about the existence of God. I mean, even if they do, I'm not absolutely saying that they don't, and it is proved. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we don't know what they do. So anyway, their concept, we can put them on a side, because a buffalo thinking God is a bigger buffalo, that will not be true, that cannot be accepted as a truth because of the same arguments that I've just presented, that there will be other groups arguing about it, because this will not make sense to the other groups. And so I think that this is kind of like a very poor analogy to try and explain God using this concept of God has to, I mean, what I'm trying to say is, so far the arguments that were presented in front of you, you should be able to see that there is always something that you can ask question about in these ideas that people have come up with. So so let's keep the definition of God on a side for a little bit later. Let's focus on a slightly separate thing, which JV did focus on towards the end of this answer. He focused on human intelligence and intelligence, for that matter, for other animals as well. Looking around, looking at ourselves, we can see there is a huge amount of design going on. There are, and even more interesting thing is, we have the ability to understand these designs. We look at the pyramid and immediately we just know that it's not just a pile of rock. We understand that there is a design in the pyramid. And the similar concept actually applies to even ourselves. We think about our ability of thinking, and we get mesmerized. Now, we have intelligence, so we should focus on the intelligence. And if we focus on the intelligence, we will live a life like a Superman. Okay, fair enough, maybe, but the question was, what is God? Now, if you try to, which I think JV tried doing in this answer, it's my speculation because he didn't clearly say that this is God or this is not God. But he alluded to the idea that you have this immense intelligence in you, and because you can eat food and the food gets absorbed in your body, and there is a mechanism inside you that can make food something that is external to you, internal to you. So that is a massive intelligence. And he kind of alluded to that and left it at that point. So instead of answering a clear-cut answer, he just left it at that. Now you make up your mind. And because by now people have forgotten what the question was, I'm sure everybody thought, wow, that's a brilliant answer. But because I was looking critically, at that point I thought, oh, okay, but where is my answer? Now I look at my intelligence, I can see it is a huge intelligence, but at the same time, following the same way of thinking, I understand that this is not something I created. This is not something I instilled in me. So there's got to be something outside me that has instilled this ability in me, in all these people. We have limitations. By definition, God doesn't have limitations in terms of power and the things. God is absolute in all his attributes. So we see that we have huge intelligence, unbelievable kind of complexity going on inside us, but at the same time we see that we have limitations. And that actually makes it very clear to us that we are not gods. We are not it. So then our question, the question remains unanswered. So that's what I found in his this lecture. That finally, the question was, what is God? And the answer was, if you focus on your intelligence, you can have a tremendous, successful life, happy life, or something to that sort of sense. But that's not my question. So I don't see how that answer is relevant. Anyway, now, because that question was not answered, let me try to give you an answer from the Islamic perspective. I'm a Muslim, and that's why I'm bringing the Islamic perspective in. And I will leave it to you. I'll just leave you to think about it and judge for yourself whether it makes sense in your mind. That is the that is what basically I request from you. So, who is God? We found that the concept of gender cannot apply to God, because if it does, then it feels like discriminatory. The concept of idea of the being, like whether it's a man, an animal, that doesn't make sense either. And we haven't found anything living outside this earth in our universe yet. So we cannot fathom the idea that it's another being inside this universe either. Now, the Islamic definition of God in the Holy Quran, in the chapter number 112, the God actually introduces him to us, and God does that because, from what our scholars have speculated is, or understood, is that God created human beings with this question in them. So remember, to start, right at the beginning, I alluded you guys to this question, that why do we have this question in us? In Islamic theology, God clearly says that God instilled this idea about God in human beings, and so when we grow up, we identify. God gave us the ability to use our intellect to identify patterns and ask questions, try to understand the world. So God did that. So with that understanding, if we try to now understand what God is, the chapter 112 of the Quran says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد. Say, He is God, the unique, the uniquely one. Allahu Samad. He is the independent. And what that also means is everything else is dependent on him. He is self-sufficient. He is not dependent on anything. Lam yalid. He does not beget. He does not beget. Walam yulad. And he was not begotten. Walam yakullahu kufuwan ahad. And there is nothing like him in your reality. Now, if you think about this definition, this identification, the way God actually presented himself to us, we think this is God's verbatim words. So I mean, let's put that on a side. I mean, you may not accept that this is God's word. That is fair enough. I mean, you can have a argument about that, and that'll be a different discussion. We can talk about that. But let's just focus on the answer and see if it makes sense to us, if it makes sense to ourselves. Um, this is a request to you. Just check in your heart whether it makes sense. So the first thing is, God says, say, God is one, the uniquely one. I mean, the word ahad means uniquely one. So we understand that God cannot be more than one for various reasons. I mean, that again is, I mean, all these claims are obviously big claims, but deep inside, if you think about it, I'm not talking about the arguments, I'm just talking about how you feel about this answer. If I tell you to introduce God to you, if I say that God is one, there is only one, does it make sense to you? Does it make sense to your heart? For most people, it does. But that's a claim. I leave your answer to yourself, whether it makes sense that there is only one God. The second criteria is, or the second attribute that God is revealing about God is, He is self-sufficient. Absolutely self-sufficient. He doesn't need anybody, and He doesn't rely on anybody. Rather, everything else relies on Him. So if you think about that idea, in my mind, that makes absolute sense. I mean, if, like when we try to look into ourselves, thinking that we have got this intelligence, so are we the God? But then we realized we have got limitations. And that's what disqualified us. We realized that we depend on things around us. That's what disqualified us from being a God. So in here, in the Islamic definition of God, God is saying that I am self-sufficient. I don't rely on anything. And everything else is reliant on me, dependent on me. The third thing is, we have seen in human society, in human history, we have seen that people came up with the idea of God and then Son of God. In Greek mythologies and in the Christian theology as well. And immediately among them you see that there are arguments. There are arguments about why does God take a son, not a daughter, and the rest of the things. So in here, in Islamic definition, God is saying, I don't beget. That means God will not have a child in the same way as human or animals do. So that says God doesn't beget. And the next thing he says, God is not begotten. So God was not born out of somebody, or God was not created by somebody. So now at this point, some people will say, okay, then what made God? That's a question. And you can look into that question a bit later, I guess. But at this point, if we think about the claim of God, just accept the claim. Just try to see whether it makes sense in your heart. That God is not, God doesn't beget. He doesn't give birth to anybody, and God is not begotten. He was not given birth. So, and the final thing God says, which I think is the most interesting statement, and the reason it's most interesting, I'll discuss that a bit later. So the last statement is, there is nothing like Him that you can think of. And in the other way, the Islamic scholars, the way they have interpreted this is, they said, if you can think of anything, know that that is not God. It is possible that when you think about the idea of God, you may have some sort of image in your head. Um, because we are, say for example, depending on where we grew up, if you grew up in a Hindu household, then everybody tells you that this is God, which is a statue. And looking at that statue gets stuck in the back of your head. So every time later on in your life, even though you understand that that statue cannot be God, when you refer to God, immediately that statue image gets it basically shows up in front of you. That is normal. As human beings, we have that tendency. But in this last statement, God is telling us that whatever you are thinking, that is not God. You just cannot fathom what God is. So what that does is it deals with all these arguments. How is he? How does he look? Does he have 10 legs, 5 heads, 20 body? How much does he weigh? And all these sort of questions are addressed in just one statement. Simply says, don't worry. You just cannot fathom. You just cannot imagine what God is. And if you have imagined something, know that that is not God. So if you just quickly review the points, number 1 point is God is claiming God is one. Does it make sense to you? God saying God is self-sufficient, independent, and he doesn't depend on anything whatsoever. Does it make sense to you? Should a God have that sort of a ability, that sort of independence? He is not begotten, and he doesn't beget. Make sense? It sounds like, yeah, that's how it should be, because otherwise, if you take the example of this, let's stop. Otherwise, I keep on just talking. So, he doesn't beget, and he is not begotten. And the final thing is, he is not like anything you can think of. Does it make sense now? Now, lots of people ask this question, why do we refer to God as he? Now, that's a problem with the translation. And, in different languages, gender plays a role in different way. Or the words, like in Hindi, lots of the things have got gender, like a bus is a he, she. A country, we refer to our country as a motherland, whereas in Germany they call it a fatherland. So in different languages we have got these ways of attaching gender to words. Now God, according to the Islamic definition, God doesn't have a gender. And from the definition I just gave you, obviously, God clearly says that God is not like anything you can think of. So you can think of a man and a woman. So God is not like that. So the concept of gender doesn't apply to God. So God is, we just refer to God using the pronoun he. And in our translations, you will see that people write every time the he with a capital H, just to make it clear that this he is here not in the traditional sense. The he here is suggesting that we are talking about some super. It's a special definition of the gender-based pronoun he. This is a special definition of that, and we are basically using that to refer to God. So when we, in our words, when we say he and refer to God, we understand that we are talking about God, and we are using the he word only because of the limitation of the language, rather than accepting, rather than believing that God is a masculine being. That concept doesn't apply to God. So I hope you I mean, go and watch the original video. I'll put the link underneath so that you can do that. Watch the original video and then think about the explanation that I've given, and see whether it makes sense to you, whether it actually resonates with you. And if you think I've missed something, if you think I've missed the point, which is possible because I'm quite thick, people said. I mean, it has been proved many, many times that I'm quite thick. So please feel free to leave a comment explaining how you think I've missed something or what I have missed and what would be the right way of then answering this question, what God is. And yeah, go on, define God in your way and see if that makes sense to everybody. So with that, I'll end it here today. I hope to see you again soon. Take care. All the best.